I always thought being the reliable son meant something. For 8 years, I had been my parents' financial lifeline, covering their mortgage, utilities, groceries, and every emergency that came their way. I never questioned it because family comes first, right? I worked overtime, took on freelance projects, and delayed my own dreams to keep their household afloat. My wife Sarah understood, though. I could see the strain in her eyes when we had to postpone buying a bigger house for our daughter Emma. But family is family, and I believed that loyalty and sacrifice would be recognized someday. Little did I know that all my devotion had been building toward the most crushing revelation of my life. Before we dive into this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Please hit that like button and subscribe if you enjoy these real-life stories. Trust me, what I discovered about my family will make you question everything you think you know about unconditional love. Now let me tell you how my world completely fell apart in a single afternoon. My name is Mark, and I am 32 years old. I work as a senior software engineer in Cincinnati, Ohio, making about $120,000 a year. My wife Sarah teaches elementary school, and we have a beautiful 5-year-old daughter named Emma who lights up every room she enters. We live in a modest 3-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood where kids still ride bikes until sunset and neighbors actually know each other's names. Growing up in the suburbs of Columbus, our family seemed pretty typical on the surface. Dad Robert spent 35 years as an electrician before retiring at 65. He was always the strong, silent type who believed in hard work and keeping your word. Mom Linda worked as a registered nurse for 28 years until her arthritis forced early retirement. She had this incredible ability to make everyone feel loved and cared for, or so I thought. Then there was my older brother, Dylan. 3 years, my senior Dylan had always been the golden child who could do no wrong in our parents' eyes. While I spent my teenage years studying, working part-time jobs, and planning for college, Dylan was the charming one who got away with everything. He barely graduated high school, dropped out of community college after one semester, and had been bouncing between dead-end jobs and unemployment ever since. But here is where the story gets interesting. Despite being 35 years old, Dylan still lived in our childhood home with Mom and Dad. He had never moved out, never been truly independent, and never contributed meaningfully to household expenses. Instead, he had mastered the art of manipulation, using his charm and our parents' soft hearts to avoid any real responsibility. Meanwhile, I had worked my way through college on scholarships and student loans, graduated with honors in computer science, and built a successful career from the ground up. Sarah and I met during my final year at Ohio State, and we had been married for 7 wonderful years. We were the kind of couple who still held hands during grocery shopping and made each other laugh until our stomachs hurt. The contrast between Dylan and me could not have been starker. While I was changing diapers, paying mortgages, and building a future, Dylan was sleeping until noon, playing video games, and coming up with creative excuses for why he could not hold down a job. His latest stint had been at a local auto parts store, which lasted exactly 6 weeks before he quit because the manager was too demanding. What bothered me most was not Dylan's failures themselves, but how our parents consistently enabled his behavior. Every time he got fired, they would comfort him and tell him it was not his fault. Every time he needed money, they would find a way to provide it. And every time I suggested that maybe some tough love was needed, I was told that I did not understand, and that Dylan was going through a rough patch. This rough patch had been going on for over 15 years. Despite my frustration with the family dynamics, I genuinely loved my parents and wanted to help them. When Mom's health issues started requiring expensive medications and Dad's arthritis began limiting his ability to take on side electrical work, I stepped up without hesitation. It started small, with offering to pay for groceries during a particularly tight month, but it gradually expanded into something much more substantial. The financial support began in late 2017, when Mom had her first major health scare. She needed surgery for a herniated disc that workers' compensation only partially covered. The medical bills were overwhelming for 2 people living on retirement income, so I offered to help. What started as a temporary solution became a permanent arrangement that nobody ever formally discussed. By 2018, I was essentially subsidizing my parents' entire lifestyle. Every month, I would transfer $3,200 to their checking account. The breakdown was always the same: $1,800 for the mortgage payment, $300 for utilities, $400 for groceries, $500 for mom's medications and medical appointments, and $200 for their car. Insurance. Let me put this in perspective. Over 8 years, I had contributed over $300,000 to keep my parents' household running. That money could have paid off my own mortgage or funded Emma's entire college education. But I never complained because I believed it was the right thing to do. The emergency expenses were what really added up, though. In 2019, their roof developed a massive leak during a spring storm. The repair cost $8,000, which I paid without hesitation because they had nowhere else to turn. 2 years later, their ancient air conditioning system finally died during a brutal Ohio summer. Another $6,500 from my savings account. The biggest hit came in 2023, when Mom needed emergency gallbladder surgery. Even with Medicare, the out-of-pocket costs reached $12,000. Once again, I stepped up and paid the entire amount, because the alternative was watching my mother suffer. Just last year, Dad's truck broke down and needed a new transmission. Another $3,500 that I somehow found room for in our already tight budget. Meanwhile, Dylan contributed absolutely nothing. He lived rent-free, ate groceries that I paid for, enjoyed utilities that I funded, and benefited from a home that I was essentially buying for the family. When I occasionally brought up the idea that maybe Dylan could contribute anything to the household expenses, Mom would get defensive and say things like, "He is trying his best," or "Not everyone is as fortunate as you." Fortunate. As if my success was pure luck, rather than the result of years of hard work, sacrifice, and responsible decisions. The most infuriating part was watching Dylan treat our parents' home like a hotel. He would sleep until noon, leave dirty dishes in the sink, use their car without asking, and invite friends over for parties that kept the neighbors awake. When Dad would finally get frustrated and suggest that Dylan find his own place, Mom would immediately jump to his defense, and the conversation would end. Sarah was incredibly patient about the whole situation, but I could see the strain it was putting on our own family. We had postponed buying a larger house because so much of our income was going to my parents. We had skipped family vacations, delayed home improvements, and lived much more frugally than our income would normally allow. Emma was starting to ask why we could not take trips like her classmates' families, and I found myself making excuses that broke my heart. But I kept telling myself that it was temporary, that eventually Dylan would get his act together, or that my parents would recognize my sacrifices and make sure I was taken care of when they were gone. I believed that doing the right thing, even when it was difficult, would somehow be rewarded in the end. Everything changed on a Tuesday afternoon in March, when Dad had what the doctors called a mild cardiac episode. It was not a full heart attack, but serious enough to require a 3-day hospital stay and a wake-up call about mortality for our entire family. Mom was absolutely beside herself with worry, calling me every few hours with updates and asking me to handle various administrative tasks while Dad recovered. On the second day, Mom asked me to go to their house and retrieve some important paperwork from their bedroom safe. She needed their insurance information and some medical directives for the hospital. She gave me the combination, which happened to be Emma's birthday, and told me to look for a blue folder containing their health insurance documents. I found the blue folder easily enough, but as I was closing the safe, I noticed a thick manila envelope labeled "Last Will and Testament" in Dad's careful handwriting. My hands started shaking as I held that envelope. I had never thought about my parents' will before, mainly because they were both healthy and I assumed we had many more years together. But something about seeing it there so official and final made my heart pound. I should have put it back and walked away. I should have respected their privacy and waited for them to share the contents when they were ready. But curiosity got the better of me, and I found myself carefully opening the envelope with trembling fingers. What I discovered inside that envelope destroyed everything I thought I knew about my place in our family. The will was dated from 2021, which meant they had updated it relatively recently. As I read through the legal language, each paragraph felt like a physical blow to my chest. The house that I had been paying the mortgage on for years was being left entirely to Dylan. The savings account that I had helped rebuild after Dad's retirement was going to Dylan. The investment portfolio that had grown thanks to my consistent contributions was designated for Dylan. Every single asset, every piece of property, every dollar in their possession was being left to my older brother. The only thing mentioned for me was our grandfather's old pocket watch, which might have been worth $200 at most. I sat on their bedroom floor reading those pages over and over again, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. After contributing over $300,000 to their household, over 8 years after sacrificing my own family's financial security to keep them comfortable after being the reliable son who never said no to any request for help, I was being left with essentially nothing. The worst part was not just the financial betrayal, though, that stung deeply. It was the realization that despite all my efforts, despite all my sacrifices, despite being the son who actually showed up and took care of business, my parents still saw Dylan as their primary heir. The son who contributed nothing was getting everything, while the son who gave everything was getting scraps. I felt physically sick. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely fold the documents back into the envelope. The room felt like it was spinning, and I had to sit down on their bed to keep from falling over. 8 years of my life, 8 years of working overtime and skipping vacations and telling my own daughter that we could not afford things, all so that Dylan could inherit a house he had never helped pay for. The drive home was a blur. I somehow made it back to my house without really remembering the trip. When Sarah saw my face, she immediately knew something terrible had happened. I showed her the will, and she was just as shocked as I was. She had always been supportive of helping my parents, even when it meant sacrifices for our own family, but this felt like the ultimate betrayal of that trust. That night, I barely slept. I kept running through memories of all the times I had chosen my parents' needs over my own family's wants. Every canceled vacation, every delayed purchase, every overtime hour I had worked to make sure their bills were paid on time. It all felt meaningless now. By morning, I had made my decision. I was not going to confront my parents directly about the will. That would only lead to drama, excuses, and probably some lecture about how I was not supposed to be snooping through their private documents. Instead, I decided to let my actions speak for themselves. If Dylan was going to inherit everything, then Dylan could start taking care of everything. The first thing I did was cancel all the automatic transfers I had set up to their checking account. 8 years of $3,200 monthly payments were officially over. I also called their utility companies and removed my credit card as a backup payment method. From now on, if bills went unpaid, that was their problem to solve. Sarah was completely supportive of my decision. She had watched me stress about their finances for years, and she knew how much our own family had sacrificed to keep my parents comfortable. "You have done more than enough," she told me over breakfast while Emma played with her cereal. "If they want to leave everything to Dylan, then they can figure out how to pay for everything without you." The first week after I stopped the payments, nothing happened. My parents had enough in their checking account to cover their immediate expenses, and I figured it would take at least a month before they noticed the missing funds. I used that time to prepare myself mentally for the inevitable conversations that were coming. Week 2 brought the first sign of trouble. Mom called on a Thursday evening, her voice slightly strained. "Honey, there seems to be some issue with our mortgage payment this month. The bank says it is late, but I thought you had already taken care of it." I told her that I had been really busy with work projects and that I would look into it later. She seemed satisfied with that explanation and hung up after chatting briefly about Emma's upcoming school play. By week 3, the situation was escalating. Dylan, who had been living his carefree lifestyle for so long, suddenly found himself facing the reality of actual financial responsibility. He came to me on a Saturday afternoon looking more panicked than I had ever seen him. "Mark, something is seriously wrong with Mom and Dad's finances. Bills are piling up and they are asking me to help, but you know I do not have that kind of money." I looked at my older brother, this 35-year-old man who had never held a job for more than 6 months, and felt a mixture of pity and satisfaction. "Maybe it is time for you to find steady employment," I suggested calmly. "They are getting older, and they need someone reliable to help them out." Dylan's face went through several expressions before settling on confusion. "But you have always handled their money stuff. Can you not just cover things like usual until I figure something out?" The entitlement in his voice was staggering. He genuinely believed that my financial support was just a permanent feature of our family dynamic, something he could count on while contributing nothing himself. "I have my own family to worry about now," I replied. "Sarah and Emma are my priority." Week 4 brought the text message that I had been expecting but still was not prepared for. It came on a Wednesday morning while I was reviewing code at work. No greeting, no how are you doing, no acknowledgement of our relationship as mother and son. Just 5 words. The mortgage is due. I stared at that message for several minutes, feeling a complex mixture of anger and vindication. Here was my mother, the woman who had raised me to be polite and considerate, sending me a demand disguised as an emergency notification. No, please, no explanation, no recognition that I had been voluntarily covering their mortgage for years, just an expectation that I would immediately solve their problem. My response was equally brief. I know. Good luck with that. The phone rang within minutes. Mom's voice was sharp with panic and confusion. What do you mean, good luck with that, Mark? We need your help. The payment is 3 days overdue and the bank is charging late fees. Mom, you have been managing your finances for decades before I started helping. I am sure you and Dylan can figure something out. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Dylan does not have that kind of money, and you know it. Why are you being so difficult about this? That word difficult hit me like a slap across the face. After 8 years of never missing a payment, never complaining about the financial burden, never asking for recognition or gratitude, I was being called difficult for finally setting a boundary. I have been covering your expenses for 8 years, I said calmly. Maybe it is time for someone else in the family to step up. The conversation ended with Mom hanging up on me, something she had never done in my entire life. Within an hour, Dad called with a much more measured approach. He acknowledged my years of help and asked if we could sit down and talk about what was happening. I agreed to meet them that weekend, knowing that the conversation we were about to have would change everything between us forever. When Saturday arrived, I drove to their house with a heavy heart, but a clear conscience. It was time for some truths to come to light, starting with the fact that I knew exactly how they really felt about my place in this family. Walking into my childhood home that Saturday felt surreal. The living room where I had spent countless hours doing homework, watching cartoons with Dylan, and having family movie nights now felt like foreign territory. Mom had made coffee and set out some store-bought cookies, a far cry from the elaborate spreads she used to prepare when I visited. The financial strain was already showing in small ways. Dad sat in his usual recliner looking older and more tired than I remembered. Mom perched on the edge of the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Dylan was notably absent, probably hiding upstairs to avoid the uncomfortable conversation he had helped create. Son, we need to talk about this money situation. Dad began, his voice carrying the same authoritative tone he had used when I was in trouble as a kid. Your mother and I do not understand why you suddenly stopped helping us. We thought we could count on you. There it was. Not gratitude for 8 years of support, not acknowledgement of my sacrifices, but disappointment that their financial safety net had disappeared. I took a deep breath and decided it was time for complete honesty. I found your will when I was looking for the insurance papers last week. The color drained from both their faces instantly. Mom's hand flew to her throat, and Dad's jaw tightened in that way it did when he was caught off guard. The silence in the room was deafening. Mark, you had no right to go through our private documents, Mom finally said, but her voice lacked conviction. She knew I had every right to feel betrayed. You are leaving everything to Dylan. I continued, keeping my voice steady despite the emotions churning inside me. The house that I have been paying the mortgage on for 8 years. The savings account that I helped rebuild. The investments that grew because I covered your living expenses. All of it goes to him. Dad cleared his throat uncomfortably. Dylan needs more help than you do. You have a good job, a stable marriage, a nice house. You have made something of yourself. Dylan. Dylan needs our support. The logic was so twisted that I almost laughed. Because I had worked hard and made responsible choices, I deserved nothing. Because Dylan had failed at everything and refused to grow up, he deserved everything. It was like being punished for success and rewarded for failure. So my reward for 8 years of financial support is a pocket watch worth maybe $200. Mom's eyes filled with tears, but I was beyond being moved by her emotional displays. We thought you would understand. We thought you were helping because you loved us, not because you expected something in return. I did help because I loved you. But finding out that my love and sacrifice meant so little that I am essentially written out of your lives was a wake-up call I needed. The conversation continued for another hour, with my parents alternating between defensive justifications and desperate pleas for me to reconsider. They explained that they had always worried about Dylan's future, that they felt he needed a safety net more than I did, that they assumed I would be fine without their help. But what they could not explain was why they had never discussed this with me, why they had let me sacrifice for years, while knowing that none of it would ever be acknowledged or reciprocated, why they had treated me like a reliable ATM, while planning to leave everything to the son who had never contributed anything. When I finally left that afternoon, nothing had been resolved. My parents still believed they were justified in their decisions, and I was more convinced than ever that I had made the right choice in cutting off their financial support. The drive home gave me time to process everything that had been said, and one thing became crystal clear: I was done being taken advantage of. The next few weeks were revealing in ways I had not expected. Without my monthly transfers, my parents were forced to confront the reality of their financial situation. Dylan, faced with the prospect of actually having to contribute to household expenses, suddenly became very motivated to find employment. Mom called several more times, each conversation following the same pattern. She would start with pleasantries, then gradually work her way toward asking when I planned to resume the payments. When I consistently told her that those days were over, she would become frustrated and eventually hang up. Dad took a different approach, trying to appeal to my sense of family duty and suggesting that I was being selfish. But the most interesting development was watching Dylan scramble to find work. Within 2 weeks of my financial withdrawal, he had applied to more jobs than he had in the previous 2 years combined. Suddenly, the demanding managers and unreasonable schedules that had driven him away from previous jobs seemed more tolerable when the alternative was watching his inheritance slip away due to foreclosure. 3 weeks after our confrontation, Dylan actually got hired at a local warehouse. The job paid $15 an hour, which was not amazing, but it was honest work with consistent hours. For the first time in years, he was contributing something to the household budget, even if it was just enough to cover groceries and utilities. A month and a half after I stopped the financial support, I received the text message that perfectly summarized my relationship with my family. It came on a Thursday morning while I was in a meeting with potential clients, and when I saw Mom's name pop up on my phone, I expected another guilt trip about family obligations. Instead, I got 5 words that revealed everything. The mortgage is due. No. Good morning, son. No. How are Sarah and Emma? No acknowledgement that she was asking for over $1,800 from someone she had essentially disinherited. Just a demand disguised as an urgent notification, as if I was still their personal bank account rather than their son. I finished my meeting before responding, taking time to craft a reply that would send a clear message without being cruel. Finally, I typed back, "I know. Good luck with that." The response was immediate and predictable. My phone rang within 30 seconds, and Mom's voice was a mixture of panic and indignation. "Mark, what is wrong with you? We need that mortgage payment today, or we will get hit with late fees. Mom, you raised 2 sons. Maybe it is time for the other one to step up. Dylan cannot possibly cover a mortgage payment on his warehouse salary. Then maybe you should have thought about that before deciding he deserved to inherit the house." There was a long silence before she spoke again, her voice smaller and more vulnerable than I had heard in years. "We never meant for you to feel unappreciated. We just thought. We thought you would always be there for us regardless. I was there for you. For 8 years, I was there for every bill, every emergency, every crisis. But being there does not mean letting myself be taken advantage of indefinitely." The conversation ended with Mom promising to work something out and asking if we could talk more about this later. I agreed to talk, but I made it clear that my position on financial support was not going to change. Over the next few weeks, I watched from a distance as my family scrambled to adjust to their new reality. Dylan picked up extra shifts at the warehouse and started selling some of his gaming equipment to help with bills. Dad began taking on small electrical jobs for neighbors despite his arthritis because they needed the extra income. Mom started clipping coupons and shopping at discount stores for the first time in years. It was not easy watching them struggle, but it was necessary. For too long, my financial support had enabled Dylan's immaturity and my parents' poor financial planning. By removing myself from the equation, I had forced all of them to face the consequences of their choices. The most satisfying moment came 6 weeks later when Dylan called me directly. His voice was different, more mature, somehow stripped of the entitled tone I had grown accustomed to over the years. "Mark, I owe you an apology," he said. I never realized how much you were doing for mom and dad until I had to start doing it myself. He went on to explain that working full-time and contributing to household expenses had given him a new perspective on responsibility and sacrifice. He was not asking me to resume the payments, which surprised me. Instead, he was acknowledging that my years of support had been a gift, not an obligation, and that he was finally ready to be the adult son our parents needed. The conversation with Dylan marked a turning point in our relationship. For the first time since we were kids, I felt like I was talking to my brother rather than to someone who saw me as a resource to be exploited. It did not erase the hurt of discovering how little my contributions had meant to our parents' long-term planning, but it gave me hope that our family might eventually find a healthier dynamic. As for my parents, they eventually adjusted to their reduced financial circumstances. Dad's part-time electrical work brought in enough to cover the mortgage, and Dylan's warehouse job handled most of the other expenses. They had to make some lifestyle changes, like eating out less frequently and being more careful about unnecessary purchases, but they managed to stay afloat without my support. The will remained unchanged as far as I knew, but that no longer mattered to me. I had learned that my worth as a son was not determined by how much money I could provide or what I might inherit someday. My value came from the love I showed my wife and daughter, the integrity I maintained in my work, and the self-respect I had finally learned to protect. Today, my relationship with my parents is different, but perhaps more honest than it has ever been. We still talk regularly, and I still love them deeply, but our interactions are no longer built on financial dependency. When they need help with something I can reasonably provide, like moving furniture or fixing a computer problem, I am happy to assist. But the days of being their primary source of financial support are over permanently. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had never found that will. Would I have continued supporting them indefinitely, never knowing how little my efforts meant to their future plans? Would Dylan have ever learned to be responsible if the safety net had remained in place forever? Would I have eventually built up enough resentment to damage our relationship beyond repair? I am grateful that I discovered the truth when I did, even though it was painful. Learning that my parents saw me as a provider rather than a son who deserved equal consideration was devastating, but it also freed me from a dynamic that was not healthy for anyone involved. The most important lesson I learned from this experience is that genuine love and respect cannot coexist with exploitation. When someone consistently takes advantage of your generosity while planning to exclude you from their future, that is not love, that is convenience. And recognizing the difference between the two is essential for maintaining your dignity and self-worth. My advice to anyone facing a similar situation is simple: set boundaries and stick to them. Your value as a family member should never be measured by how much you can provide financially. If someone only appreciates you when you are useful to them, then you deserve better relationships in your life. What about you? Have you ever discovered that your sacrifices for family members were not appreciated the way you thought they were? How did you handle learning that your generosity was being taken for granted? Share your experiences in the Portered comments below, because these stories help all of us feel less alone in our struggles. If this story resonated with you, please give it a like and subscribe for more real-life experiences that remind us we are not alone in facing difficult family dynamics. Share this video with someone who might need to hear that setting boundaries is not selfish, it is necessary. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that your worth is never determined by how much you can give to others. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is teach people to value what they have by showing them what life looks like without it. Take care of yourselves, and I will see you in the next video.